Shalom Aleichem and welcome to Parsha Lomdus on Parshas Pinchas. This year we're going to be talking about the idea of Chalukas Eretz Yisrael, how Eretz Yisrael was divided up amongst the Shvatim, and specifically with regards to Shevet Levi, what was their status as far as having a nachla in Eretz Yisrael. So in our Parsha, this is in Perek Chavav, Psukim Nun Beis and onwards, the Torah talks about how this Chalukah took place, how Eretz Yisrael was divided, what it was based on, how it was done. And then in Pasuk Samach Beis, the Torah tells us that Shevet Levi was counted from Miben Chodesh V'mayla. They were counted from 1 month and upwards. And they were not counted together with all the rest of the Yidden. Why? Ki lo nitan lohem nachla b'soich b'nei Yisrael. Because they were not given a nachla in Eretz Yisrael. Meaning all the Shvatim were given a portion of Eretz Yisrael, but Shevet Levi was not given a nachla. Lo nitan lohem nachla b'soich b'nei Yisrael. This idea that Shevet Levi does not have a nachla in Eretz Yisrael is also mentioned in Parshas Kairach, Perek Yudches Pasuk Chaf, Vayomer Hashem el Aaron, Ba'artzam le'sinchol, וחלק lo yeh lecha b'seicham, where Hashem told Aaron that he would not have a portion in Eretz Yisrael. Ba'artzam le'sinchol, וחלק lo yeh lecha b'seicham. It's also in Parsha Shoftim, Perek Yudches Pasuk Aleph, where it says lo yeh l'kohanim haLevim kol shevet Levi chelek v'nachlo im Yisrael. That Kohanim and Levim, the entire Shevet Levi, does not have a chelek and a nachlo together with all the rest of the Yid. So this is something which I find repeated a few times in the Torah, how Eretz Yisrael was divided up amongst the Shvatim. Every Shevet got a chelek in Eretz Yisrael, besides for Shevet Levi. Now, if we look in the Ramabm, in Hilchot Shmiטה ויובל, Perek Yud Gimel, the Ramabm brings us l'halacha. And he says there, Kol Shevet Levi musharin shelo yinchalu be'eretz Canaan. The entire Shevet Levi is warned not to take a nachlo in Eretz Canaan. V'chein hein musharin shelo yitlu chelek bebiza b'shasha kovshim esa'arim. And likewise, they're also warned against taking a portion of the spoils when the cities of Eretz Yisrael are captured. They would divide the spoils, all the spoils of war, but Shevet Levi was not able to take a portion of the spoils. Shenemar, continues the Ramabm, as the Pasuk says, Lo yeh l'kohanim haLevim kol Shevet Levi chelek v'nachlo im Yisrael. This was the Pasuk from Parshas Shoftim. That Kohanim and Levim, kol Shevet Levi, should not have a chelek v'nachlo im Yisrael. So the Ramabm explains, chelek, when the Pasuk says chelek, they shouldn't have a chelek, that's bebiza. That means they do not take a share of the spoils. And when it says v'nachla, that means ba'aretz. They don't get a portion of Eretz Yisrael. V'cheinu oimer, then he brings another pasuk. This is from Parshas Kairach, ba'artzam le'sinchol, v'chelek lo yeh lecha b'soichem bebiza. It says ba'artzam le'sinchol, that means they don't get a portion in Eretz Yisrael, and chelek lo yeh lecha b'soichem, they don't get a portion of the spoils. So according to the Ramabm, this is the actual loisase. Kol Shevet Levi musharin is a loisase. They're warned against taking a chelek in Eretz Yisrael, and also against taking a chelek of the spoils. This is an actual loisase. If we look in the Minyan HaMitzvahs in the beginning of Hilchot Shmiטה ויובל, the Ramabm there counts it as a mitzvah yotes, shelo yinchal kol Shevet Levi be'eretz Yisrael, that Shevet Levi doesn't get a portion of Eretz Yisrael. That's one mitzvah. And a second mitzvah, chaf, shelo yikach Shevet Levi chelek bebiza. They don't take a portion of the spoils. So it's actually two different mitzvahs according to the Ramabm. Each are a loisase. Shevet Levi does not have a chelek, they're not allowed to take a chelek in Eretz Yisrael, and they're not allowed to take a chelek in the spoils. Continues the Ramabm, Ben Levi aykayin shenotel chelek bebiza. What's taka going to be the din? If a Levi or a Kohen took a portion of the spoils, they took a chelek of the biza, says the Ramabm loike, that Kohen or Levi gets malchus because they transgressed a loisase. And if they took a portion of Eretz Yisrael, if they took a piece of land, then the Ramabm says, we just take it away from them. So here's a whole discussion in the Achronim and the Noisa Kelim on the Rambam. What's the difference between the Biza and the Nachla? Why, when a Kohen or a Levi takes a portion of the spoils, do they get Malchus? And when it comes to taking a portion of land, there the din is we just take it away. Why is there this difference? Maybe in both cases they should get Malchus, or maybe in both cases we should just take it away. Why by the spoils do we give Malchus, and by a portion of the land do we take it away? That's not for our discussion. Then the Rambam continues in Halacha Yud Aleph. It seems to me, so in other words, the Rambam doesn't have a source for this. There's no Gemara, there's no Chazal, but he says it seems to him that this loisas that we just said, that a Kohen or a Levi cannot take a chelek of Eretz Yisrael, or they cannot take spoils, is only in the land that was promised to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, v'yarshua b'neihem, and their descendants inherited that land, and it was divided up amongst the Shvatim. That's where a Levi is not allowed to take a chelek. Avol sha'ar kol ha'arotzos shekovesh melech mimalchei Yisrael. Any other additional lands that a Jewish king will conquer, even though those lands become incorporated in Eretz Yisrael, and they become part of Eretz Yisrael, right? If a Melech Yisrael representing the Yidden conquers additional lands, those lands are part of Eretz Yisrael. But still, says the Rambam, since that's not part of the original land that was promised to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and it's not part of the original land that was settled and divided up amongst the Shvatim, this is new territories. So here says the Rambam, Harei Akehanim va'alavim ba'osan ha'arotzos ubebizasan kachol Yisrael. In these new lands that a king will conquer later, here Kehanim and Levim do get a chelek, sai in the land, and sai in the spoils, just like all of the Yidden. That's the shit of the Rambam. And the Ravid right there argues, and the Ravid says, no, even in these additional territories that a king will conquer, since those become incorporated into Eretz Yisrael, there too, Kehanim and Levim do not have a chelek, not in the land and not in the spoils. And he has two proofs. Says the first proof is that if you're going to tell me that in those new lands, Kehanim and Levim have a chelek, then the din should be that in those lands, we don't need to give Truma and Meiser to a Kohen or Levi, because Truma and Meiser is given to them instead of the fact that they have land. Since they don't have land, so to compensate for that, we have to give Truma and Meiser. But if you paskin, like the Ramabm paskin, then in these new additional territories, Kehanim and Levim do have a chelek, then says the Ravid, the halacha should be that in those territories we don't have to give Truma and Meiser. But of course that's not the halacha. The halacha is that we still give Truma and Meiser even in these expanded territories. So that's a raya that there too Kehanim and Levim don't have a chelek. That's one raya. And a second raya, he says, from the milchama against Midian, coming up in Parshas Matos, when the Yidden went to war against Midian and they brought back spoils, what happened? So the spoils were divided amongst the Yidden, between those who went to war and those who didn't go to war, and the Levim didn't take. The Levim didn't take a chelek of the spoils as part of the Yidden. They only got sort of Truma. From what the Yidden got, they had to give away Truma to the Kehanim and the Levim. So I see there, even though it wasn't part of Eretz Yisrael proper, it wasn't part of the land that was promised to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, it was an additional land. But when they went to war and they conquered Midian, the Levim did not get a chelek in the spoils together with the Yidden. The spoils went only to the Yidden, and the Levim had to give Truma to the Kehanim and Levim. That's the second proof of the Ravid, that even in the new territories that a Melech conquers, Kehanim and Levim do not have a chelek, not in the land and not in the spoils. So it's Machlokes Rambam and Rebbe. The last thing we're going to point out before we move on is that the Mishnah Melech there in Halacha Yud, where he says, Kol Shevet Levi Musharin Shelo Yinchalu Beretz Canaan, that Shevet Levi is warned not to have a portion in Eretz Canaan. So the Mishnah Melech brings as follows: Kosev HaSmag, in Lavin Simen Reish Ayin Vav, the Smag brings the la'asid lavai noitlin chelak ba'aretz. That la'asid lavai, when Mashiach comes, then the Levim will have a chelak in Eretz Yisrael. So when did the Levim not get a chelak in Eretz Yisrael? That was in the past. But la'asid lavai, in the future, when Mashiach comes and we go back to Eretz Yisrael, says the Smag, the Levim will have a chelak ba'aretz. Shanemer, as it says, there's a pasuk in Yecheskel, Sha'ar Levi Echad, that the portion of Levi will be one. K'de'isa beperek yesh noichlin daf kuf chav beis, and he's mitzayin to a Gemara in Bava Basra, daf kuf chav beis. If you learn the Gemara there, especially with the Pirush of the Rashbam, you will see that the Gemara says that when Mashiach comes, Eretz Yisrael will be divided into 13 portions. 12 of the portions will be given to the 12 Shvatim, including Shevet Levi, which means Yosef, instead of getting 2, Yosef will get 1. The 12th will go to Levi, and the 13th will go to Melech HaMashiach. So I see there, from that Gemara, based on the Pasuk in Yecheskel, that La'asid Lavai, Shevet Levi is going to have a Chelek in Eretz Yisrael, together with all the Shvatim. So that's what the Smag is referring to, that La'asid Lavai, Shevet Levi will have a Chelek in Eretz Yisrael, based on the Gemara in Bava Basra. So we're going to focus here on these two Nakudas. Number one, the machlokes between the Ramabm and the Ravid with regards to additional territories that a Melech will conquer, if Kohanim and Levim have a chelek in those additional territories. And the second Nakuda, and that is that La'asid Lavai, when Mashiach comes, will Shevet Levi have a chelek in Eretz Yisrael? So the Smag is bringing from the Gemara that it seems like Shevet Levi, La'asid Lavai, will have a chelek in Eretz Yisrael. So the Minchas Chinuch brings mitzvah Tov Ches, that in this Nakuda, whether or not Shevet Levi will have a nachla in Eretz Yisrael, La'asid Lavai. So the Minchas Chinuch wants to say that this is going to be actually a machlokes between the Sifri and our Gemara, the Babli. He says, because Rashi in Parshas Shoftim, Rashi brings a Sifri, where it says, Al kein lo yhoyu leLevi chelek v'nachla in Eretz Yisrael. So Rashi brings from the Sifri, L'rabbeis keini knizi v'kadmoini, that the pasuk is including, when the pasuk there says, Al kein lo yhoyu leLevi chelek v'nachla, etc., the pasuk is being marbe even keini knizi v'kadmoini. That not only does Shevet Levi not have a chelek in Eretz Yisrael of then, which was the 7 nations, but Shevet Levi will also not have a chelek v'nachla la'asid lavai in the additional lands of Keni, Knizi, v'Kadmoni. So according to the Sifri, it's clear that Shevet Levi does not have a chelek la'asid lavai either. Since the Sifri has this drasha to be marbe Keni, Knizi, v'Kadmoni la'asid lavai, that even there Shevet Levi won't have a nachla. So that's a raya that it applies even la'asid lavai. Even la'asid lavai, when we'll be given Keni, Knizi, v'Kadmoni, even then Shevet Levi will not have a nachla. But our Gemara, as we quoted, as the Mishnah al-Melech brought from the Smag, from the Gemara in Bava Basra, our Gemara seems to be of the opinion that Shevet Levi, la'asid lavai, will have a chelek in Eretz Yisrael. So the Minchas Chinuch settles on the fact that it's a machlokes between the Sifri, that says they won't have a chelek, and the Bavli, our Gemara, which says Shevet Levi will have a chelek. But then he goes ahead to ask two kashas. He says, kasha number one, he doesn't understand our Gemara. Our Gemara that says Shevet Levi will have a nachla la'asid lavai. He says, how could that be? Since it's a loisasa, as the Ramabm said, Shevet Levi is warned, there's a azhara, there's a loisasa against them taking a nachla in Eretz Yisrael. So if it's a lav b'Torah, if it's an actual lav, how could this lav be uprooted la'asid lavai? La'asid lavai, the Torah is still relevant. And the Torah says Shevet Levi is not allowed to take a chelek in Eretz Yisrael. So how could we simply say that la'asid lavai, this lav, this loisasa will become bottle? L'chayra, the mitzvahs of the Torah are eternal. That's one kasha. The second kasha, he says that l'chayra, it's clear from the Ramabm that the Ramabm paskin like the Sifri, that Shevet Levi will not have a chelek la'asid lavai. Where do we see this? So he brings three proofs. Proof number one, that the Rambam in Hilchas Malachim mentions how La'asid Lavai, Melech HaMashiach will get a Chelek in Eretz Yisrael. That one portion in Eretz Yisrael will go to Melech HaMashiach himself. The source of that is in the Gemara Bava Basra, which we mentioned before, where in that same Gemara it says, L'chayra, how also one portion will go to Shevet Levi. But the Ramabm doesn't mention that. The Ramabm doesn't say anywhere that one portion will go to Shevet Levi. So from that same place in the Gemara, he brings one Nakuda, how Melech HaMashiach will get a Chelek, without mentioning anywhere another Nakuda from the same Gemara that Shevet Levi will get a Chelek. So that seems to indicate that the Rambam doesn't agree with the Gemara in that Nakuda. In this Nakuda, the Rambam agrees with the Sifri that Shevet Levi will not have a Chelek in Eretz Yisrael. It's one proof. Second proof, he says that the Rambam says that La'asid Lavai, when the Yidden get Eretz Yisrael, they will give cities to Shevet Levi, just like in the past, since Shevet Levi didn't have a Chelek in Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, all the Yidden had to donate cities to the Levim to live in. The Levim were given cities by the rest of the Yidden for them to live. And the Rambam says the same thing, La'asid Lavai. La'asid Lavai, the Yidden will again give cities to the Levim for them to live in. So that is another proof that the Levim won't have a Chelek in Eretz Yisrael. Because if the Levim have their own Nachla in Eretz Yisrael, then why do the Yidden have to give them cities? They have their own Nachla. So the fact that the Rambam says that even La'asid Lavai, all of us are going to give the Levim cities to live in, that again is another raya that according to the Rambam, La'asid Lavai, the Levim will not have a Chelek in Eretz Yisrael. And a third proof, he says, because the Rambam's Lashon was, in Halacha Yud Aleph, Yeira'ali she'ein hadvarim amurim ele ba'aretz shenichusa aleha bris, Lavram, Liyitzchak, Uliyankov. That this halacha that Levim do not have a Chelek in Eretz Yisrael only applies to all the cities that were promised to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Keini, Knizi, V'Kadmoini is part of the territory that was promised to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. It wasn't actually conquered by the Yidden yet. In the past, it's only going to be conquered La'asid Lavai, but it was part of the territory promised to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And the Rambam said that the halacha applies to all the territories, Shanichrusa Aleha Bris, Lavram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, which means that according to the Rambam, even Keini, Knizi, V'Kadmoini is included within the Isur, within the Lav, where Shevet Levi cannot have a Chelek. So therefore, from all of these different places, the Minchas Chinuch comes to the conclusion that the Rambam must paskin like the Sifri, that even La'asid Lavai, Shevet Levi does not have a Chelek v'Nachla in Eretz Yisrael. Which leads him to his second question, L'chayra, if we have a machlokes between the Sifri and the Bavli, where the Sifri holds that Levi will not have a Chelek in Eretz Yisrael, and the Bavli holds that Shevet Levi will have a Chelek in Eretz Yisrael, machlokes Bavli and the Sifri, L'chayra, the Rambam has to paskin like the Bavli. That's klolei. In Klolei Psak Halacha, that's how it works. A machlokes Sifri and Bavli, you paskin like the Bavli. So why would the Rambam paskin here like the Sifri? Ha'ich pasuk Sifri neged hashat shelanu. How could the Rambam paskin like the Sifri against our Talmud Bavli? So these are the kashas that the Minchas Chinuch asks. He doesn't really resolve them, but al koponim, what I can take away from the Minchas Chinuch is a few clear nakudas. Nakuda number one, that it's a machlokes Sifri and Bavli whether Shevet Levi has a Chelek v'Nachla La'asid Lavai. And point number two, that the Rambam paskins that, like the Sifri, that Shevet Levi will not have a Chelek in Eretz Yisrael, not in the original Eretz Yisrael, and not in the additional Keini, Knizi, V'Kadmoini. Shevet Levi does not have a Chelek in Eretz Yisrael, even La'asid Lavai. That's how the Rambam paskins. And then we have the two kashas that he asked. Kasha number one, working backwards, why did the Rambam paskin like the Sifri and not like the Bavli? And then kasha number two, which was the bigger kasha on the Bavli and on the Smag, which paskined like the Bavli, because remember the Smag, the Mishnah al-Melech brings from the Smag does paskin like the Bavli. According to the Smag, La'asid Lavai, Shevet Levi will have a Chelek in Eretz Yisrael. So he asked the kasha there, how could it be? Since it's a loisasa, since it's a lav, that Shevet Levi is not allowed to take a chalukah in Eretz Yisrael, so how could that be bottle La'asid Lavai? How could that mitzvah evaporate La'asid Lavai? That was the approach of the Minchas Chinuch. Now, we're going to now take a look at, this is from חידושי הגר"ח, חידושים from Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, Reb Chaim Brisker, what's called חידושי הגר"ח סטנסיל. It's in Bava Basra on Daf Kuf Chav Beis, that same Gemara that we quoted before. And the Reb Chaim brings the machlokes that we mentioned before from the Ramabm and the Rebbe, where again the Ramabm and the Rebbe were arguing about what's the status of additional territories that a king conquers. If a Melech Yisrael conquers additional territories, those territories become incorporated within Eretz Yisrael. They become part of Eretz Yisrael. So what's the status over there? Do Levim have a Chelek there or not? So the Ramabm said, yes, they do. In the additional territories that a king will conquer, Shevet Levi does have a Chelek v'nachla, and the Rebbe said, they don't. So Reb Chaim says, well, let's understand what's the shitta of the Ramabm. Why is the Ramabm being mechalek between Eretz Yisrael proper and additional territories? L'chayra, what's the reason for a chiluk? Since even additional territories become incorporated within Eretz Yisrael, and the additional territories are part of Eretz Yisrael, and they have kedushas haaretz, and you have to give truma meiser there, so it's part of Eretz Yisrael. So why is the Ramabm mechalik? Why does the Ramabm say that in those new territories, Shevet Levi does have a chelek v'nachla, and only in the original Eretz Yisrael proper, only there is there a lav against Shevet Levi taking a chelek v'nachla? What's the difference? So Reb Chaim explains that the difference is the following. Eretz Yisrael proper, the original Eretz Yisrael, the way that was divided, it was divided amongst the Shvatim. Right? He calls this Chalukas HaShvatim. And that's what we see in our Parsha. In our Parsha, the Torah is talking about how it was divided up amongst the Shvatim. Each Shevet was given a Nachla. Chalukas HaShvatim. However, when it comes to additional territories, when a king conquers new territories, yes, those new territories become part of Eretz Yisrael, and have this kedushas haaretz, and all the halachas that apply in Eretz Yisrael apply in those new territories. But he says in the new territories we don't find that they were divided up amongst shvatim. There was no chalukas hashvatim in the new territories. So how were the new territories divided? They were divided equally amongst the Yidden. The Yidden divided up these new territories amongst themselves. So the Yidden inherited it and settled it as Klal Yisrael, not as Shvatim. So this is a very important difference, as Reb Chaim. The original Eretz Yisrael proper, the Chalukah then was Lishvatim, divided up amongst the Shvatim. That was the way the Chalukah was done. But the additional territories we don't find were divided up amongst Shvatim. It wasn't that different Shvatim were given different parts of the new territories. The new territories were just divided stam amongst the Yidden. The Yidden divided up the new territories without them being assigned to different Shvatim. It wasn't Chalukas HaShvatim. So says Reb Chaim, now it makes perfect sense. The shit of the Ramabm is very clear. When was Shevet Levi excluded? Shevet Levi is only excluded from Chalukas HaShvatim. When you're dividing Eretz Yisrael amongst the Shvatim, and every Shevet takes a chelek, so Shevet Levi is not allowed to take a chelek. Shevet Levi is excluded from Chalukas HaShvatim. But when you're dividing not amongst Shvatim, when you're dividing amongst the Yidden, and all the Yidden are getting as individual Yidden, or as members of Klal Yisrael, not according to their Shvatim, then in that type of Chalukah, Shevet Levi is included. Shevet Levi is only excluded from Chalukas HaShvatim. But Chalukas Yisrael, whatever is divided up amongst the Yidden, not Al Shvatim, but to Klal Yisrael, there Shevet Levi is included. Why not? So that's the svar of the Ramabm. Where is there a lav against Shevet Levi taking a portion only in Eretz Yisrael proper? Because there the Chalukah was Lishvatim. But the Ramabm goes on to say, if a king conquers new territories, since in the new territories there's no Chalukas HaShvatim, there's no concept of dividing it up amongst the Shvatim, it's only divided up amongst the Yidden. So if it's being divided up amongst the Yidden, not L'Shifteihem, then Shevet Levi is not excluded, and therefore the Ramabm says Shevet Levi gets a chelek v'nachla in the additional territories. Then Reb Chaim goes on to bring the smag that we mentioned, that la'asid lavai, the smag says the Yidden will have a chelek in Eretz Yisrael. The la'asid lavai, the Levim will have a chelek in Eretz Yisrael, as the pasuk says, Shar Levi echad. So Reb Chaim goes on to say that it seems to him, what's the pshat here? This is only b'shar ha'rotzos shekovshu sheloi nemar bohem chalukas shvatim. What the smag means, and what the Gemara in Bava Basra means, that la'asid lavai Shevet Levi will have a chelek, it's not talking about in Eretz Yisrael gufa, in Eretz Yisrael proper. It's talking about the additional territories that la'asid lavai will become incorporated in Eretz Yisrael. When Mashiach comes, la'asid lavai, we're not just going to have the original Eretz Yisrael, we're going to expand. Melech HaMashiach will fight wars, and Melech HaMashiach will expand Eretz Yisrael and will take on new territories. So that's where Shevet Levi will have a chelek v'nachla. Like the Rambam here says, that the halacha is Shevet Levi is allowed to have a chalukah in the new territories. So that's what the Gemara in Bava Basra is talking about. That's what the smag is talking about. That Shevet Levi will have a chelek in Eretz Yisrael la'asid lavai, but not in the original Eretz Yisrael, not in Eretz Yisrael proper. It's in the expanded territories, in the new territories that Mashiach will conquer, and it's for the same reason. Because there too, in the new territories that Mashiach will conquer la'asid lavai, those are not going to be divided amongst the Shvatim. There's not going to be chalukas hashvatim. That's only going to be, as we said, chalukah to all the Yidden. So therefore, if there's no chalukas hashvatim there, even la'asid lavai, Shevet Levi will have a chelek there. So therefore, if we take a step back, it comes out that Reb Chaim basically answered both questions of the Minchas Chinuch according to his mahalach. Firstly, according to Reb Chaim, there's no machlokes between the Bavli and the Sifri. The Minchas Chinuch decided that it's a machlokes Bavli and the Sifri. According to the Sifri, Shevet Levi will not have a chelek la'asid lavai. And according to the Bavli, Shevet Levi will have a chelek la'asid lavai. So the Minchas Chinuch said it's a machlokes. According to Reb Chaim, it's not a machlokes. They're talking about different things. They both agree that in Eretz Yisrael proper, the original Eretz Yisrael, and by the way, I didn't say before, but including Keni Knisa v'Kadmoni, Reb Chaim brings that also, including Keni Knisa v'Kadmoni, there Shevet Levi will not have a chelek v'nachla, because there's chalukas hashvatim. In the 7 nations that we originally had, plus the Keni Knisa v'Kadmoni that was promised to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Since in those lands there's chalukas hashvatim, so there Shevet Levi la'asid lavai will not have a chelek. That's the Sifri. And the Bavli agrees. Everybody agrees with that. When the Bavli says that Shevet Levi will have a chelek la'asid lavai, the Bavli is talking about not Eretz Yisrael proper, not even Keni Knisa v'Kadmoni. It's talking about new territories that Mashiach will conquer. In the new territories that Mashiach will conquer, since there's not going to be chalukas hashvatim, it's just going to be divided up amongst the Yidden. So there Shevet Levi, Levim will have a chelek, and that's what the Bavli is talking about. Shar Levi echad, that Shevet Levi will have a chelek v'nachal in Eretz Yisrael. It means in these new territories. That is what Reb Chaim says. And he finishes off by saying that according to the Ravid would be different. Because the Ravid, if you remember, the Ravid does not differentiate between Eretz Yisrael proper and additional territories. The Ravid says that Shevet Levi is not allowed to have a chelek in Eretz Yisrael, and that included, at least in the past, that included even additional territories conquered by a king. That was the shit of the Ravid. So says Reb Chaim, but if we bring in the Smag and the Bavli, which says that la'asid lavai they will have a chelek in Eretz Yisrael, then how does the Ravid have to learn that? The Ravid l'shitosai, since the Ravid does not make a distinction between Eretz Yisrael proper and additional new territories, the Ravid sees them all as the same. So once we bring in the Smag and the Bavli, which says that la'asid lavai Levi will have a chelek in Eretz Yisrael, there's no reason to say, according to the Ravid, that that's going to be only in the new territories. According to the Rebbe, that could be even in the original Eretz Yisrael, even in Eretz Yisrael proper, even there Shevet Levi will have a nachla according to the Babli and the Smag. Because the Rebbe doesn't see a difference between the original Eretz Yisrael and the new territories. Al Kolpan. That's the shita of Reb Chaim. I'll just say that l'chayra, there's 3 strong kashas on this mahalach of Reb Chaim. One of them he himself raises, the other 2 he doesn't, but l'chayra they're simple questions. I leave it to whoever's listening to the shiur maybe to come up with an answer. The first question that Reb Chaim himself asks on his own svara is the din by biza, that by the spoils, the halacha is that Shevet Levi also doesn't have a chelek in the spoils. Right? So we mentioned before, there's 2 different loisas says. One loisa said that Shevet Levi doesn't have a chelek in Eretz Yisrael, in land, and the other loisa said that Shevet Levi doesn't have a chelek in the spoils. The spoils, Reb Chaim says, he acknowledges the spoils were also not divided up amongst the Shvatim. The biza was divided up amongst the Yidden. There was no chalukas hashvatim when it came to the spoils, when it came to the biza. So l'chayra, according to the whole mahalach of Reb Chaim, that Shevet Levi is only excluded from chalukas hashvatim, only those things which are divided up amongst shvatim, their Shevet Levi is excluded. But whatever is divided up amongst all the Yidden, alt klal Yisrael, not lishifteihem, Shevet Levi has a chelek. So how can by the spoils, Shevet Levi doesn't have a chelek? The spoils also are not divided up amongst the shvatim. The spoils are chalukas b'nei Yisrael. So their Shevet Levi should have a chelek. But the halacha is that Shevet Levi doesn't have a chelek. That's one kasha on Bechlal, the svara of Reb Chaim. Second kasha that I was thinking, that his whole teretz of la'asid lavai, l'chayra, is a big daichak. What's the kasha? The kasha is that we have a Bavli based on the pasuk in Yecheskel that says Shar Levi Echad, that Levi will have a chelek in Eretz Yisrael. So what's Reb Chaim's answer? That's only going to be in the new territories that Mashiach will conquer, because in the new territories there's no inyan of chalukas hashvatim, it's just chalukas b'nei Yisrael. So but then l'chayra, if Shevet Levi is getting a chelek there, not als Shevet Levi, only als b'nei Yisrael, so the lashon pasuk is shver. The lashon of the pasuk is Shar Levi Echad, and there the pasuk mentions the other shvatim, Shar Ruvain Echad, and mentions all the shvatim. Ruvain has a Shar, and Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, every Shevet has a Shar, and Shar Levi Echad. So the lashon of the pasuk Shar Levi Echad seems to indicate that it's a chelek given to Shevet Levi. Shar Levi means l'chayra Shevet Levi. But Reb Chaim's whole answer is it's not going to be given to Shevet Levi. Levim are going to have a chelek, la'asid lavai, but only in the new territories, because in the new territories it's not chalukas hashvatim, it's just chalukas b'nei Yisrael. So all the Yidden have, not alt shvatim, but alt individuals. So if Shevet Levi is getting that type of a chelek, not alt a Shevet, just alt people, alt being members of Klal Yisrael, then the lashon of the pasuk Shar Levi Echad l'chayra is a bissel shver. And another kasha, that l'chayra, the way the Ramabm is explaining the Bavli and the Smag, there's like no chidush. What's that Shevet Levi has a chelek la'asid lavai in the expanded territories, in the new territories? But that's not a chidush of la'asid lavai. That was even in the past. Even in the past, the Ramabm said, if the king, like David HaMelech, conquered new territories, Shevet Levi has a portion in those territories. That's what the Ramabm said. So there's nothing unique there about la'asid lavai. So if that's all, so l'chayra, how can Reb Chaim say that when we have this pasuk in Yecheskel, Shar Levi Echad, and the Gemara in Bava Basra, and the Smag which say a chidush that la'asid lavai, Shem la'asid lavai, there's going to be Shevet Levi is going to have a chelek v'nachla, as if this is a chidush. But then he goes on to explain that it's actually nothing new. It's the halach which the Ramabm said, which already applied back in history, that if there's new territories, Shevet Levi has a chelek in the new territories. So there's no chidush, there's no nevuah for la'asid lavai of Shar Levi Echad, and there's no chidush of la'asid lavai. It's the same old halacha that was always in play. That's another kasha on Reb Chaim. But again, what we gained, at least according to Reb Chaim's mahalach, is there's no machlokes between the Bavli and the Sifri. Right? No machlokes. The Babli is talking about new territories. The Sifri is talking about the original Eretz Yisrael, including Keni Knizi v'Kadmoni. Oh, and I forgot to say, this also answers the other kasha of the Minchas Chinuch. The other kasha of the Minchas Chinuch was, how can the Smag and the Babli say that Lasid Lavei Shevet Levi will have a chelek? L'chayra, there's a loisase. How could the loisase be uprooted Lasid Lavei? According to Reb Chaim, it's understood. The loisase is only talking about the original territories. The Eretz Shiva Amamin, the 7 nations of Eretz Yisrael, and Keni Knizi v'Kadmoni. There's a loisase that Levim cannot have a chelek, and that remains Lasid Lavei. According to Reb Chaim, the Levim are going to have a chelek, Lasid Lavei. That's in the new territories that the king will conquer, and in the new territories that the king will conquer, there's no loisase. So b'meila, according to Reb Chaim's Mahalach, there's no contradiction between the lav, ba'atzam lo sinchol, v'chelek lo yelacha b'seichem. There's no contradiction between that lav and the Levim lo asid lavei having a chelek, because their chelek is only in the new expanded territories. That's the Mahalach of Reb Chaim. Now, these inyanim are also addressed by the Rebbe in לקוטי, at least in 2 places. And we're going to see here that the Rebbe had a Mishnah Rishona and then a Mishnah Basra. The Rebbe learned at first in one way, and then in later years and later Halakim, the Rebbe took a different approach. So the first place where we're going to take a look in the לקוטי, this is Parshas Chelek Chav Gimel, Parshas Matos, the first Sikha. There the Rebbe brings the Ramabm that we mentioned before, where the Ramabm says Yeroeli, that the halacha that Shevet Levi does not have a chelek in Eretz Yisrael is only be'eretz shenichas aleha bris, l'Avram litzchak leYaakov v'Yarshua b'neihem v'nischalka lahem. Only in the original land that was promised Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, but not in the new territories. So the Rebbe there points out a diuk in the Ramabm. The Ramabm doesn't just say that it applies in the land that was promised to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. It doesn't just say, Ela ba'aretz shenichasa aleha bris l'Avram, Yitzchak, leYaakov. No, he continues. He goes on to say some more words. V'yarshuha b'neihem v'nischalka lahem. Now, the Rebbe in לקוטי in at least 2 places addresses our sugya. And we're going to see here that we have what seems to be a Mishnah Rishona and a Mishnah Basra. The Rebbe at first took one approach, and then in later years, later Halakim, the Rebbe took a different approach. First place we're going to look is in the לקוטי Chelek Chav Gimel, Sichan Parshas Matos, page 211, Ha'ara 58. There, the Rebbe is addressing the halach in Ramabm that we quoted before, where the Rambam says that the loisas against Shevet Levi taking a chelek v'nachla in Eretz Yisrael is only ba'aretz shenichras aleha bris l'Avram litzchak leYaakov v'Yarshua b'neihem v'nischalka lahem. As we already mentioned before many times, not in the new territories. So the Rebbe here in Chelek Chav Gimel noticed something, and that is that the Rambam's lashon here is very at length. He doesn't just say that the loisase only applies ba'aretz shenichas aleha bris l'Avram litzchak leYaakov. He doesn't just say that. He goes on to say more words. V'Yarshua b'neihem v'nischalka lahem. That the loisase only applies in the land that was promised to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. V'Yarshua b'neihem v'nischalka lahem. So those words are very important, because if we think about Eretz Keni Knizi v'Kadmoni, so where do those lands fall in? So Keni Knizi v'Kadmoni, those lands were promised to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. They're included in the land Shanichas aleha bris. However, they were never inherited. We never actually got them. We never actually conquered those lands, and we never actually divided those lands. Those are only going to be taken la'asid lavei. So from the beginning of the Rambam's lashon, that the lav applies ba'aretz shenichas aleha bris l'Avram litzchak leYaakov, it would seem that the lav also applies in Kenik Nizav Kadmoni, because Kenik Nizav Kadmoni was promised to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But then the Ramabm continues, V'yarshuha b'neiim v'nischalka lahem. It only applies in the land that was already inherited and the land that was already divided. That would seem to exclude Kenik Nizav Kadmoni, because Kenik Nizav Kadmoni we never actually got yet. So the Rebbe brought up the possibility that perhaps the Rambam here is being Mayrich Bilshainoi, specifically because he wants to say that in Kenik Nizav Kadmoni they could have a Chelek. If the Rambam was of the opinion that Shevet Levi will not have a Chelek even in Kenik Nizav Kadmoni, then in Kenik Nizav Kadmoni the Lo Yisaseh applies, then all the Rambam would say is Yeira li sheina dvar mamurim ele bar shnichras el bris lavim Yitzchak Yaakov. The Lo Yisaseh applies in the land that was promised to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, but that includes Kenik Nizav Kadmoni. But from the fact that the Rambam went on to say v'yarshuha b'neiim v'nischalka lahem, the Rambam is trying to tell you that Kenik Nizav Kadmoni is not included. That really in Kenik Nizav Kadmoni, Shevet Levi does have a chelek la'asid lavai. La'asid lavai, when we get Kenik Nizav Kadmoni, Shevet Levi there could have a chelek because the Lo Yisaseh does not apply there. The Lo Yisaseh only applies in the land that v'yarshuha b'neiim v'nischalka lahem. It only applies to the land that was already divided up. But Kenik Nizav Kadmoni, that la'asid lavai, Shevet Levi could have a chelek v'nachla there. In which case, the Rambam would be paskening not like the Sifri, because the Sifri, as we mentioned before, the Sifri holds that even in Kenik Nizav Kadmoni, Shevet Levi will not have a chelek v'nachla. So in that Ha'ara 58, the Rebbe raises this possibility, but in the end he says it can't be. And he quotes the Minchas Chinuch that we already said before, that the Minchas Chinuch said, from the fact that the Rambam holds that, he brought a few proofs, but the fact that the Rambam holds that even La'asid Lavai we're going to be giving cities to the Leviim for them to live, and we're going to be giving them cities to live even in Kenik Nizav Kadmoni, the Rambam says. So the Minchas Chinuch used it as a proof. That proves that according to the Rambam, even in Kenik Nizav Kadmoni, Shevet Levi will not have a Chelek v'nachal. And that's how he leaves it in Chelek Chav Gimel. So basically, in Chelek Chav Gimel, the Rebbe is noticing that the language of the Rambam in Halacha Yud Aleph seems to l'chayra give off the impression that in Kenik Nizav Kadmoni, Shevet Levi will have a Chelek v'nachla in Eretz Yisrael, not like the Sifri. However, in Chelek Chav Gimel, he leaves it by saying that l'chayra, that's not true, because as the Minchas Chinuch pointed out, it seems to be clear from the Rambam that even in Kenik Nizav Kadmoni, Shevet Levi will not have a Chelek v'nachla. However, in a later Chelek, in Chelek Lamed Ches, a Sikh in Parshas Pinchas, on our Parsha, the Rebbe again is addressing this topic, and the Rebbe again calls attention to this diuk that he mentioned in Chelek Chav Gimel, v'yarshuha b'neiim v'nischalka lahem. But here the Rebbe combines it with another amazing diuk. In Halacha Yud, the Rambam said, Kol Shevet Levi musharin shelo yinchalu be'eretz Canaan. That Shevet Levi is warned, shelo yinchalu be'eretz Canaan. So the Rebbe's medayik, what's pshat be'eretz Canaan? Why is the Rambam saying be'eretz Canaan? The Rambam's lashon should be, and usually is in such a situation, be'eretz Yisrael. He should say, Kol Shevet Levi musharin shelo yinchalu be'eretz Yisrael. Why is the Rambam saying shelo yinchalu be'eretz Canaan? And if the Rambam is, and he goes on to say, if you want to tell me that the Rambam is saying be'eretz Canaan because he wants to exclude the additional territories that a king will conquer, which he's going to say later that there Levi does have a chelek v'nachla, but he says if the Rambam is going to spell that out anyways later, he's going to say clearly that in the new territories that a king conquers, Shevet Levi has a chelek v'nachla. Why would he have to say here be'eretz Canaan? Say be'eretz Yisrael, that Shevet Levi is warned that they don't have a chelek in Eretz Yisrael. And then you're going to clarify later, that only means Ba'aretz Shenichas Alavim Yitzchak Yaakov. But it doesn't apply to the expanded territory. So you're going to say it clearly. So why is the Rambam here saying this lashon kol Shevet Levi musharin shelo yinchalu be'eretz Canaan? So with the combination of these two diyukim, the Rebbe says it's clear that what he suspected in Chelek Chav Gimel is actually true, and with this the Rebbe deviates from the Minchas Chinuch. The Rebbe comes to the conclusion that the lav kol Shevet Levi musharin shelo yinchalu be'eretz Canaan, the lav, the loisase, was only about Eretz Canaan, which means the original 7 nations that we conquered in the days of Yeshua. That's what the loisase is. Ba'artzam loisinchol, וחלק לא יהיה לך בסייכם means kol Shevet Levi musharin shelo yinchalu be'eretz Canaan. Only Eretz Canaan was included in the lav. Keini knizi v'kadmoni is not included in the lav. And therefore, in Keini knizi v'kadmoni, Shevet Levi is allowed to have a nachla. So it comes out, according to the Rebbe, that there are 3 categories of lands. There is the 7 nations, which he calls Eretz Canaan. And there we say clearly, Kol Shevet Levi musharin shelo yinchalu be'eretz Canaan. In Eretz Canaan, the original 7 lands, there's a loisase, Shevet Levi cannot have a chelek v'nachla, and that's absolute. Then we have what the Rambam clearly addresses in Halacha Yud Aleph, which is new territories that a king will conquer. New territories that a king will conquer that were not promised to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So there the Rambam says clearly that Shevet Levi has a chelek. And then we have a 3rd category, which is Eretz Keini Knizi v'Kadmoni. In Eretz Keini Knizi v'Kadmoni, it's in between. It's part of the land that was promised to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, but it's not part of the Eretz Canaan where there is a loisase against Shevet Levi having a chelek v'nachla. So therefore, the Rambam will say that Shevet Levi does have a chelek v'nachla. That Shevet Levi has a chelek v'nachla in Eretz Keini Knizi v'Kadmoni, because the loisase doesn't apply there. The Rambam doesn't mention it clearly, because the Rebbe says the Rambam has a klal that halachas that are mechudosh, that are not clearly mentioned in Shas, he is only merams. Since it doesn't mention anywhere clearly in Chazal that Levim will have a chelek in Keini Knizi v'Kadmoni, so the Rambam doesn't mention it clearly. He's only merames it by saying that the loisase applies in Eretz Canaan, and therefore the mashmos from there is that in Keini Knizi v'Kadmoni there's no loisase. So now we can go back to the kashas of the Minchas Chinuch, and we can see how both kashas are going to be answered. According to the Mahalach of the Sikha, there's a machlokes, as the Minchas Chinuch pointed out. It's a machlokes between the Bavli and the Sifri. The Sifri says that Shevet Levi will not have a chelek in Keini Knizi v'Kadmoni. That's the shit of the Sifri. The Bavli says that Shevet Levi will have a chelek in Eretz Yisrael la'asid lavai. According to the Mahalach of the Sikha, the Bavli is talking about Keini Knizi v'Kadmoni. In the land of Keini Knizi v'Kadmoni, Shevet Levi will have a chelek. So in this machlokes, the Rambam paskins not like the Sifri, the Rambam paskins like the Bavli. The fact that the Rambam says, Kol Shevet Levi musharin shelo yinchalu be'eretz Canaan, the Rambam is telling us that the Shevet Levi only does not have a chelek in Eretz Canaan. But in Keini Knizi v'Kadmoni, Shevet Levi does have a chelek. So the Rambam is paskining like the Bavli. Shar Levi Echad. Shevet Levi has a chelek in Eretz Yisrael la'asid lavai in Keini Knizi v'Kadmoni. So the Rambam paskins like the Shas, like the Bavli, not like the Sifri. As for the other kasha of the Minchas Chinuch, since we have a loisase, how could the loisase be batal la'asid lavai? It's also for Enford. The loisase is not going to be batal la'asid lavai according to the Rambam. The loisase is only talking about, as the Rambam says, Eretz Canaan. The loisase was only given in the Eretz Canaan, which is the land of the 7 nations. In Keini Knizi v'Kadmoni, there was never a loisase. So therefore, in Keini Knizi v'Kadmoni, Shevet Levi will have a chelek la'asid lavai, and it's not going against the loisase. The loisase is only in Eretz Canaan. So that's also understood. As for the proof of the Minchas Chinuch that we mentioned before, that if we have to give cities to the Levim Lasid Lavai, that seems to prove that they won't have a Chelek in Eretz Yisrael. So the Rebbe says, Lav Dafka. Could be both. Could be that Shevet Levi will have their own Chelek V'Nachal in Eretz Yisrael in Keni Knisa V'Kadmoni. But yet, the Yidden will still have a mitzvah to give them cities as part of the mitzvah of Trumas and Meisers. We have to give Levim Truma, Kohanim Truma, we have to give Levim Meiser. So one of the things that we have to give is cities. It doesn't mean just because we're giving them cities that they don't have their own Chelek V'Nachla. It could be both are true. Levim have their own Chelek V'Nachla, and at the same time the Yidden have a mitzvah to give cities alt Truma Meiser. So that's the Mahalach of the Rebbe. So to summarize, what we have here is three different ways of approaching the sugya. We have from the Minchas Chinuch, from Reb Chaim, and from the Rebbe. According to the Minchas Chinuch, he saw it as a machlokes between the Sifri and the Bavli, whether or not Levim will have a chelek in Eretz Yisrael Asid Lavai, and he saw the Ramabm as paskening like the Sifri, that Shevet Levi will not have a chelek v'nachla in Eretz Yisrael, including in Keni Knisa V'Kadmoni. That's what the Minchas Chinuch learned. And we left off with the kashas. A, why would the Ramabm paskin like the Sifri, not like the Bavli? And two, how could, according to the Smag, and according to the Bavli, that they will have a chelek lasid lavai, what happened to the loisas that says that the Shevet Levi cannot have a chelek in Eretz Yisrael? Then we had the Mahalach of Reb Chaim. Reb Chaim wanted to say that there's a difference between what's divided up chalukas hashvatim and what's divided up amongst the Yidden, not al shvatim. And he wants to say that therefore there's no machlokes between the Bavli and the Sifri. The Sifri is talking about the part of Eretz Yisrael which is divided up amongst the Shvatim. That's the 7 lands plus Keni Knisa V'Kadmoni. Those are divided up amongst the Shvatim, and their Taka Shevet Levi, even La'asid Lavai, doesn't have a chelek. That's where the Loisasa is. But as the Ramabm said, if there's new territories that are going to be conquered, there Shevet Levi will have a chelek, because there's no chalukas hashvatim. There it's only chalukah amongst Bnei Yisrael. And that's what the Bavli is talking about, that La'asid Lavai, Levi will have a chelek in those new territories. That's what Reb Chaim wanted to explain it, and we asked the various kashas that we asked on that mahalach too. And finally we come to the mahalach of the Rebbe, at least the Mishnah Achronim of the Rebbe. The Rebbe learns that the loisase against Shevet Levi having a chelek v'nachlo is only in Eretz Canaan, was only in the 7 nations. That's what the loisase was. And therefore, yes, there's a machlokes Bavli and the Sifri regarding Keni Knisa V'Kadmoni. The Sifri holds that La'asid Lavai, Shevet Levi will not have a chelek, not even in Keni Knisa V'Kadmoni. But the Bavli holds, no, they only don't have a chelek in the 7 lands, Eretz Canaan. But they do have a chelek in Keni Knisa V'Kadmoni, and that's how the Rambam paskins. And b'meila, everything is understood. We're not being oiker a loisase, and the Rambam is paskening good like the Bavli, and everything works out. That's how the Rebbe learned. And the only difficulty was that we had to come onto a shtickle daichak to say that even though Shevet Levi is going to have a chelek, their own chelek in Keni Knisa V'Kadmoni La'asid Lavai, still there's going to be a mitzvah for the Yidden to give them additional cities and additional territories for them to live, out the inyan of Truma and Meiser, which the Minchas Chinuch thought was a definite proof that it means they're not going to have their own chelek La'asid Lavai, but the Rebbe is saying we can live with both. We can live with them having their own chelek, plus a mitzvah on the Yidden to give them cities. Just conclude with the shit of the Rogatchover, which is very interesting. The Rogatchover, the Tzafnas Paneach, this is Tzafnas Paneach ala Torah in Parshas Kairach, he's actually mechalek between Kohanim and Levim. Very original shita. He says there, he brings the Sifri, where the Sifri says that Ba'artzim Loisinchol includes Keni Knisa V'Kadmoni, and the Rogatchover says that's only Kohanim. The Sifri is only addressing the Kohanim. Kohanim, they don't have a chelek in Eretz Yisrael, and they also don't have a chelek in Keni Knisa V'Kadmoni. However, Levim, he says, do have a chelek. And that's what the Gemara is talking about in Bava Basra, Daf Kuf Chabeis, V'shar Levi Echad, that Levim will have a chelek. So basically, he also is learning, the Rogatchover is learning, that there's no stira between the Bavli and the Sifri. The Bavli and the Sifri are not arguing. The Sifri, which says they won't even have a chelek even in Keni Knizi V'Kadmoni, is talking about Kehanim. So Kehanim have no chelek even in Keni Knizi V'Kadmoni. But Levim, but the Bavli, which says Shar Levi Echad, that Shevet Levi will have a chelek l'Asid Lavai, that's the Levim. And the Levim will have a chelek l'Asid Lavai, and whether it will be in Keni Knizi V'Kadmoni or even in Eretz Yisrael Mamish, that he doesn't say. But al kaponim, his shita is he wants to be mechalek between Kehanim, that's the Sifri, and the Bavli, which is Levim, that Levim will have a chelek l'Asid Lavai.